This is the image they tried to bury before it ever reached your screen. As of 6 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, Saturday, February 28, 2026, the flag of Canada is flying at half-mast over Parliament Hill in Ottawa, not in mourning for a person, but in mourning for an alliance. For the first time in the 158-year history of the Canadian Confederation, the Government of Canada has issued an emergency order in Council authorizing the immediate freeze of $180 billion in United States government and corporate assets held on Canadian soil. We are talking about treasury bonds. We are talking about pension fund holdings. We are talking about energy infrastructure stakes. We are talking about the frozen bank accounts of American corporations operating north of the 49th parallel. The Prime Minister addressed the nation at 5:45 a.m., flanked by the Minister of Finance and the Chief of the Defense Staff, and said 7 words that are reverberating through every trading desk on the planet. Canada will not be bullied into submission. Washington was asleep. The White House had no statement for 3 hours. The State Department switchboard crashed under the volume of incoming calls from allied embassies demanding clarification. The Pentagon issued a 1-line memo. We are assessing the situation. The most powerful nation on earth just got blindsided by its closest ally, its largest trading partner, and the country that shares the longest undefended border in human history. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly how Canada executed this financial ambush. We are going to examine the $180 billion in frozen assets and what each category means for your retirement account. We are going to explain the 6-month chain of provocation that made this inevitable. And we are going to answer the question nobody in Washington wants to ask. Can America actually survive an economic war on 2 fronts, with China in the Pacific and now Canada to the north? Buckle up. The map of the Western Alliance just caught fire. To understand why Ottawa moved today, you have to understand what Washington did the day before yesterday. On Thursday, February 26, 2026, President Trump signed Executive Order 14297, imposing a blanket 50% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States, effective immediately with no exemption period and no phase-in window. This was not a negotiation. This was not a gradual escalation. This was economic decapitation. The tariff covered everything: lumber, oil, natural gas, potash, uranium, aluminum, nickel, automotive parts, dairy, pharmaceuticals. The entire $450 billion annual trade relationship between the 2 countries was repriced overnight. According to leaked documents obtained by the Globe and Mail, the Canadian government had been tracking this possibility since November 2025, when the Trump administration first floated the idea of a 25% tariff during the ongoing dispute over Arctic shipping lanes and NATO burden sharing. Canadian intelligence services, the Communications Security Establishment, and CSIS had been running war game scenarios for months. They had a contingency plan, and it had a name. It was called Operation Maple Shield. Here's what you need to understand about Operation Maple Shield, because this is the financial mechanism that just detonated underneath the American economy. Under Canadian law, the Special Economic Measures Act of 1992, as amended in 2024, gives the Governor and Council the power to freeze, seize, or restrict any foreign assets within Canadian jurisdiction if a foreign state has engaged in actions that constitute a grave breach of international trade norms or a threat to Canadian sovereignty. The 50% tariff, applied unilaterally without WTO consultation and in direct violation of the USMCA trade agreement that Trump himself signed in 2020, gave Ottawa the legal predicate it needed to activate the full apparatus of economic warfare. The freeze order targets 4 categories. Category 1, U.S. Treasury instruments held by Canadian financial institutions. Sources at the Bank of Canada say approximately $43 billion in U.S. government bonds are now locked. They cannot be sold, transferred, or redeemed. Category 2, American corporate deposits in Canadian banks. According to leaked briefing notes from the Department of Finance, roughly $61 billion in deposits from companies like ExxonMobil, General Motors, JP Morgan, and Citibank are frozen as of 6 a.m. this morning. Category 3, energy infrastructure equity. American companies own approximately $52 billion in pipeline stakes, refinery interests, and oil sands extraction rights across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. Those equity positions are now under a judicial hold administered by the Federal Court of Canada. Category 4, intellectual property and licensing revenue. An estimated $24 billion in patent licensing, pharmaceutical royalties, and technology transfer payments owed to American companies is suspended indefinitely. But here is the catch. This is not just a freeze. According to sources inside the Privy Council office, The order includes a clause that nobody in Washington has fully processed yet. Section 7B of the amended Special Economic Measures Act allows for the progressive liquidation of frozen assets if the originating hostile action is not reversed within 90 days. That means Canada is not just holding a $180 billion hostage. Canada has given the United States a 90-day countdown clock. If the 50% tariff is not rescinded by May 29, 2026, Ottawa has the legal authority to begin selling American assets on the open market and redirecting the proceeds to a Canadian Sovereignty Stabilization Fund. This is not a negotiation tactic. This is a loaded weapon with a timer attached to the trigger. Let us talk about what $180 billion actually means in human terms, because the number is so large it becomes abstract. The entire annual budget of the United States Department of Homeland Security is $60 billion. Canada just froze 3 times that amount. The annual revenue of Ford Motor Company is $176 billion. Canada just froze more than Ford makes in a year. The market capitalization of Goldman Sachs is approximately $170 billion. Canada just froze more wealth than one of the most powerful investment banks on Wall Street is worth. And here is what nobody is talking about. The $180 billion figure is the direct freeze. The indirect exposure is estimated at $400 billion to $600 billion when you factor in derivative contracts, swap agreements, and cross-border credit facilities that reference the frozen assets as collateral. According to a flash analysis from Moody's released at 7:30 a.m. this morning, the freeze could trigger margin calls across at least 14 major American financial institutions by Monday morning. The contagion has not even started yet. We are looking at the fuse, not the explosion. Sources inside the West Wing described the mood as somewhere between panic and blind rage. President Trump was reportedly awakened at 5:50 a.m. by his national security advisor, who informed him that Canada had, in the president's own words, according to 3 people briefed on the call, declared war on us without firing a shot. The president immediately demanded options. He wanted military options. He wanted sanctions. He wanted to close the border completely. He wanted to freeze Canadian assets in the United States as a mirror response. But here is the problem that his own advisors had to explain to him in real time, and reportedly it took over an hour for the message to land. Canada prepared for this. The United States did not. Canadian holdings of American assets inside the U.S. are estimated at roughly $900 billion. But those assets are dispersed across thousands of entities, pension funds, real estate trusts, corporate subsidiaries, and individual holdings. Freezing them would require a months-long legal and administrative process involving the Treasury Department, OFAC, the SEC, and potentially dozens of federal judges. Canada did it in one stroke because they had been planning it since November. America cannot replicate it by Monday. The asymmetry is devastating. It gets worse. The energy dimension of this crisis is catastrophic, and this is where your gas prices enter the conversation. Canada supplies the United States with approximately 4.2 million barrels of crude oil per day. That is 60% of all U.S. crude imports and roughly 25% of total U.S. refinery input. According to the Department of Energy's own emergency assessment protocols, a sudden disruption of Canadian oil supply would create a 3.8 million barrel per day shortfall that cannot be replaced by domestic production, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or alternative imports within 90 days. Gasoline prices, which are already at $4.10 per gallon nationally, could spike to $7 or $8 per gallon within 2 weeks if Canada restricts energy exports as a follow-up measure. Sources inside the Canadian Ministry of Natural Resources say the energy card has not been played yet, but it is sitting face up on the table. Every refinery operator in the American Midwest understands this. The freeze was the warning shot. The oil cutoff is the nuclear option. Here is where this becomes a constitutional crisis inside the United States. The president's first instinct, according to sources familiar with the Oval Office discussions at approximately 6:15 a.m. this morning, was to invoke the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, and declare Canada a hostile foreign power. His legal team had to explain carefully and repeatedly why this is legally possible, but strategically suicidal. Declaring Canada hostile triggers NATO Article 5 consultations. It potentially voids the NORAD agreement, which means the shared early warning radar system protecting North America from incoming nuclear missiles goes offline. It could force the withdrawal of American forces from Canadian bases and the cancellation of joint Arctic surveillance operations at a time when Russian submarine activity in the Arctic is at its highest level since 1986. The president reportedly said he did not care about NORAD. 3 cabinet members pushed back. The Secretary of Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the Director of National Intelligence all told the president in a meeting that lasted 47 minutes, according to a source who was present, that declaring Canada hostile would be the single greatest gift to Vladimir Putin since the invasion of Ukraine. The president backed down, temporarily, but the counter-moves are already being assembled. Sources at the Treasury Department say the current secretary is preparing an emergency order to restrict Canadian access to the U.S. dollar clearing system, the CHIPS network that processes $1.8 trillion in daily transactions. If America cuts Canada off from dollar clearing, every Canadian bank, every Canadian exporter, and every Canadian pension fund loses the ability to transact in U.S. dollars. This would devastate the Canadian economy within weeks. But it would also signal to every other country on Earth, every ally, every trading partner, every neutral nation, that the United States is willing to weaponize the dollar against its own neighbors. Sources at the European Central Bank say Frankfurt is already running contingency scenarios for accelerated de-dollarization. The Bank of Japan issued a statement calling for calm. China's foreign ministry spokesperson said, and this should terrify every American who understands geopolitics, we note with interest Canada's lawful exercise of sovereign economic rights. Beijing is watching. Beijing is learning. Beijing is taking very detailed notes. Let us get technical about the CHIPS weaponization, because this is the specific financial mechanism that could either break Canada or destroy the dollar's dominance permanently. CHIPS, the clearinghouse interbank payment system, settles approximately $1.8 trillion per day in cross-border dollar transactions. If Canada is locked out, Canadian banks cannot settle U.S. dollar trades. They cannot pay for imports denominated in dollars. They cannot service dollar-denominated debt. It sounds like a kill shot, but here is what the Treasury Department's own analysts are warning internally. Cutting Canada off from CHIPS proves that any country can be excluded at any time for any reason. The euro, the yuan, and cryptocurrency alternatives suddenly look far more attractive to every central bank that just watched America weaponize the financial plumbing against a G7 democracy. The dollar's share of global reserves has dropped from 72% in 2000 to 58% in 2025. A CHIPS exclusion of Canada could accelerate that decline to 45% within 18 months. That is a $4 trillion shift in global reserve holdings. That is the end of American financial hegemony, not in a generation, but in a year and a half. Let us push this to the worst-case scenario, because this is where the dominoes fall in a way that should keep every American with a 401k or a pension awake tonight. It is Monday morning, March the 2nd, 2026. The markets open. The Dow futures are already down 1,400 points from overnight trading. The $180 billion freeze has triggered margin calls at Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and Bank of America. The derivative exposure means $600 billion in collateral is now legally contested. Credit default swaps on American sovereign debt spiked by 340 basis points. The dollar dropped 6% against the euro and 8% against the Swiss franc. Oil futures hit $127 per barrel. The VIX hit 62, a level not seen since 2008. By Tuesday, 3 regional banks with heavy Canadian exposure announced emergency capital raises. By Wednesday, the Federal Reserve is forced into an emergency 75 basis point rate cut to prevent a liquidity seizure in the interbank lending market. By Friday, the S&P 500 has lost 18% of its value. Retirement accounts across America have hemorrhaged $6.2 trillion in 5 trading days, and Canada has not even started liquidating the frozen assets. That is just the fear premium. The reality would be catastrophically worse. Now let us talk about what Putin and Xi Jinping see when they look at this. They see an America that has managed to alienate its most loyal ally, the country that followed the United States into Afghanistan, into Iraq, into Libya, into every military conflict since Korea. They see a NATO alliance fracturing not because of Russian aggression, but because of American arrogance. They see a president who cannot manage a relationship with a country that shares his language, his values, and his border. If he cannot keep Canada on side, what chance does he have with Germany, with Japan, with South Korea? The projection of American power depends on the alliance network. The alliance network depends on trust. Trust evaporated at 6 a.m. this morning. According to diplomatic cables obtained by Reuters, at least 4 NATO allies have requested emergency consultations. The alliance is not rallying around America. The alliance is asking whether America has lost its mind. How does this play with the American public? This is where the political coalition cracks open. The mega base sees this as an act of war and demands overwhelming retaliation. They want tariffs doubled to 100%. They want the border sealed. They want troops on the 49th parallel. But here is the fracture that could destroy the Republican majority. The business conservatives, the Chamber of Commerce wing, the CEOs who actually run the economy are apoplectic. They have supply chains depending on Canadian raw materials. They have $61 billion in frozen deposits they cannot access to make payroll on Monday. The Wall Street Journal editorial board published a piece at 8 a.m. titled "The Tariff That Broke the Alliance." Sources say at least 6 Republican senators have privately communicated to the White House that the 50% tariff must be rescinded immediately. The populist base wants war. The donor class wants peace. The coalition is splitting down the middle. History teaches us that trade wars between allies are the most dangerous kind because they destroy the trust infrastructure that takes generations to build and seconds to demolish. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930 did not just deepen the Great Depression, it shattered the international trading order and paved the road to global war. The Nixon shock of 1971, when America unilaterally abandoned the gold standard, fractured the Bretton Woods system and created decades of monetary instability. The Suez Crisis of 1956, when Eisenhower forced Britain and France to withdraw from Egypt by threatening their currencies, permanently diminished British power and ended the empire. Each of these moments seemed manageable at the time. Each unleashed consequences that lasted decades. What we are witnessing today is the Suez moment of the North American relationship. This is not just a trade dispute. This is the stress test of the entire North American order. Can the world's largest bilateral trade relationship survive a president who treats allies like adversaries? Can the U.S. dollar maintain its reserve currency status if America weaponizes it against a fellow G7 democracy? Can NATO survive if its 2 founding North American members are locked in economic war? Can the American economy absorb a $180 billion asset freeze, a potential 4.2 million barrel per day oil disruption, and a cascading financial contagion simultaneously? These are not rhetorical questions. These are the questions that will be answered in the next 90 days, and every answer could reshape the global order for a generation. We are in uncharted waters. The maps are useless. No American president has ever provoked a full-scale economic confrontation with Canada. No Canadian government has ever frozen American assets. No Western alliance has ever been tested this way from the inside. The legal frameworks are untested. The financial exposure is incalculable. The political dynamics are volatile. And the 90-day clock started ticking at 6 a.m. this morning. As we head into Sunday, watch for the emergency G7 call that sources say is being organized for tomorrow afternoon. Watch for the Federal Reserve's emergency statement expected by noon. Watch for the Canadian Parliament's emergency session on Monday. Watch for oil futures when Asian trading opens Sunday night at 6 p.m. Eastern. Watch for the president's Truth Social feed because according to sources inside the West Wing, that is where the next escalation will be signaled. It will not be a diplomatic note. It will be a 3 a.m. post in all capitals that either walks this back from the brink or pushes it into territory from which there is no return. But most importantly, watch your retirement accounts on Monday morning. Watch the price of gasoline at your local station. Watch the price of groceries on your kitchen table, because 18% of American food imports come from Canada. The consequences of this crisis are not abstract numbers on a Bloomberg terminal. They are sitting in your refrigerator, in your gas tank, and in your 401k statement. For one man in the Oval Office, this was supposed to be a show of strength. 50% tariffs, America first, make them pay. Instead, it has become the single greatest strategic blunder of his presidency. He picked a fight with the one country that could actually fight back, and he did not see the counterpunch coming. The $180 billion freeze is a mirror held up to American hubris. The alliance is burning, the markets are trembling, the 90-day clock is ticking, and somewhere in Ottawa, in a secure room beneath Parliament Hill, a team of Canadian officials is watching the same screens we are, waiting to see if Washington blinks before May 29th. Subscribe. Stay tuned. Because the next 90 days will determine whether the North American order survives or whether it joins the long list of alliances destroyed not by foreign enemies, but by the arrogance of friends. The history books are being written this weekend. And right now, they are writing a chapter that nobody in Washington ever wanted to read.